up, guys? Welcome to episode 26 of Sport Vitamins. Being a coach with creative ideas is key in modern basketball, especially when it comes to developing young players. We've always done it this way is a very dangerous phrase and absolutely don't apply well to being at the forefront of teaching basketball skills. Today's guest is Alex Sarama, player development coach at college basketball, a talent factory in Borgomanero, Italy. Alex has an extremely interesting approach to teaching individual and team skills aimed at maximizing retention from practice to the game. So, without further ado, here's the episode with Alex Sarama.
Hi, Alex. Welcome on the show.
Roberto, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for being my guest today. So why don't we just start with a little bit of a rundown on your background?
Absolutely. So I'm from the United Kingdom originally. I started coaching when I was 14 years old and just fell in love with the game. When I was 16, I started my own basketball club. Only possible to do that in England. I don't think you could do that in any other country in Europe. But we were lucky. We had some good success early on in terms of producing players. We had about 10 of our players play for junior English national teams on the girls and boys side. So I was really busy running that club and I was studying at the same time. I finished my high school and then I went to university and I read history. I stopped playing seriously when I was really young, like 19 or 20, because I always knew it was coaching that it was in coaching that I had the best chance of sticking in the game long term. And when I graduated, I had an awesome opportunity to join NBA Europe. So I started in the London office, and then I was relocated to Madrid, and I was the manager of basketball operations for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So, and that was excellent because although I did quite a bit of coaching, it was also a lot of operations and the business side of the NBA, which I got to learn, which was a really good experience for me being so young. And I got to work on some really cool events like Basketball Without Borders, Junior NBA, All-Star events, etc. And it was during this time with the NBA where I was really continuing my research. I've always been like a lifelong learner, very much the same as you, Roberto. Like, I like to read a lot, always constantly trying to find new ways to teach. And I was really learning a lot of new ideas in the field of motor learning, decision making, constraints that approach. And I wanted to have a vehicle to experiment with some of these ideas. And I didn't feel like I was coaching enough within the NBA setting. So I took a coaching position as technical director of an academy in Belgium called EA. And then I had a great opportunity to team up with Chris Oliver of Basketball Immersion. So Immersion is the world's largest coach education platform. And Chris and I share ideas for coaches at all levels, from the NBA, NCAA down to grassroots, with a lot of our ideas focused on decision-making, constraints that approach, etc. So currently I'm combining Immersion with my coaching role here at College Basket in Italy, a program I know you're familiar with, Roberto. And I do all the player development here, working with a lot of the prospects we have, typically aged between 15 and 19.
Right, great, Alex. What an amazing background, although you're very, very young. So why don't you start talking about your philosophy as far as teaching basketball?
Absolutely. So I grew up, Roberto, with more of a traditional approach, which is the approach I would say is more common in basketball still. And that's the idea of more drills and repetitions and quite a bit of on-air training without defense. And that kind of style has existed for years and years. And the sport science word for it is the reproductive approach, because it's typically as coaches, we coach how we used to be coached when we were players. And what this results in is this cycle of practices continuing, even though it may not make sense with the current information and research that we have available. So the alternative is an idea, it's called ecological dynamics or constraints-led approach. And it's basically a scientific theory which suggests that humans are complex systems. And how this translates to sport, and specifically basketball, is it's the idea that it's an interaction between the basketball player and the constraints present, which result in different things and different actions emerging. So the three different types of constraints that we have, the first one is environmental. And this could be factors such as humidity, temperature, but also critically, it could be a lot of the social factors, such as maybe a player grows up in a country where basketball isn't very popular and they don't get to access training facilities as much. Or maybe they're somewhere like Lithuania, where it's basketball is like a religion. And it could be other things, such as maybe there's someone in the family, like a dad, who played basketball at a high level. And then subsequently, growing up, that kid would have seen a lot of games. So there are a lot of environmental, social constraints. Then we have individual constraints, and these are constraints specific to each basketball player, things like height, wingspan, how they move. And these could be things which change very quickly, such as fatigue and, mood, or it could be things which take longer, such as weight, height, etc. And then the last type is the one that, as coaches, whether we're strength coaches or basketball coaches, we have the most control over, and these are the task constraints. So these are what the athlete is actually doing in a particular activity, whether that's a drill, small-sided game, whatever. And that's things like, what's the outcome of the drill? What are the rules with how they can play in a particular small-sided game? Like, what's the space they have to work in? How many players are there? Is there any equipment? Is there a point system? So it's basically the idea, Roberto, is that it's the interaction of the individual environment and task-specific constraints, which lead to skills emerging and different behaviors, etc.
Can you give us an example of a typical drill that you use with your basketball players? Because doing my research for this podcast, I listened to a lot of your posts on Instagram, for example, and you never use cones, right? You always want the players to take the decisions and to be also to be able to take a decision in that environment.
Absolutely, Roberto. So this is a better way. Let's use that cone example to really understand the constraints that approach, to think the constraints I just mentioned. So the problem with cones is they're not task representative, and that means they're basically not the same as what the player would see in a game, because there will obviously never be cones in a game ever. And every time in a game, there's going to be some type of defender and some type of decision. So the easiest way of kind of framing it is how I look at skill as a decision and then a technique and then the technique. And I think a lot of the time, Roberto, skill is looked at being only a technique thing in most, skill development practices. But the reality is it's the perception, action coupling, the decision happens first, and then the player has to use an appropriate technique as a solution. And that's the problem with cones. It's a scripted sequence known as blocked practice, where it's just repetition, and the coach tells the athlete what to do, and they're doing it. And all the research shows that block practice has very, very limited transfer to games unless it's a beginner. And if it's a beginner, there can be some benefit to doing that. But as soon as, they have some level of comfort, it's got to become more randomized. So random practice would basically be, instead of having a cone, I'm going to put a defender there. But I can apply task constraints, which I just spoke about, to that defender. So for instance, they could be live, and they can move wherever they want, but I will put them in a starting position and say, okay, now you are going to be standing here. So the defender is going to be on the 3-point line, and the ball handler is maybe going to start at the half. And you can move wherever you want, but you can't leave the 3-point line and come out. So that's an example of applying some task constraints. And basically what's going to happen now is the offensive player, it's going to be way more game-like, because they're going to actually have to look at the defender and look at cues such as their position, where they move, and then come up with an appropriate solution as opposed to just doing the cone. And so I would do a lot of stuff like that, Roberto, where it's actually a decision. And then I would typically add more constraints onto the defense. So for instance, if it's too hard, say the players find it too difficult, maybe I would say that the defender can take 2 shuffles in either direction and then they have to stop. So they basically got to try and get a defensive stop with 2 shuffles or cross step. I know you're a fan of the cross step too, the Ale Locera club. Then it could be maybe they play defense without their hands. So there's loads of different task constraints we can be creative with as a coach to shape learning for both the offensive and defensive player.
Yeah, I love this approach. And but in your philosophy, is there a time and place for like drills like 5-on-0? And I'm asking you this because for me, working as a strength coach for a senior team, you often see head coaches, I don't want to say obsessed, but they really put a lot of emphasis on drills like 5-on-0, 4-on-0, 3-on-0, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what I see 5-on-0 as being useful for is to quickly learn a pattern. And I think that can be useful because obviously, you know, say you're playing a team in the playoffs, like I know you guys have the playoffs coming up now, maybe the coaching staff want to put a new set play in for a particular opponent. And I think what 5-on-0 does is it allows you to very quickly get the players to understand the pattern and execute it. But my approach would actually be, instead of fast learning 5-on-0, I actually prefer slow learning 5-on-5. So what I would typically do, Roberto, is I would take, if I was installing a play, I would install it 5v5. And what that does, even if I had pros, I'd do it the same, whether it was pros or top youth prospects. And I think what it does is it allows the players to see the context. And the thing is, it's like, I use this analogy of chess and memorizing patterns. It's like a lot of, I was reading this book, The Art of Learning by Josh Waitzkin. And he talks about how when he was young, a lot of, like, he was a chess genius. A lot of other players memorized these very complex opening sequences, right? These starting moves to try and get checkmates. But then once he got out of that and he beat their start, they couldn't play because they just memorized the pattern. I think this is the main problem with 5-on-0, especially with younger players. And younger players, I mean players up until probably the ages of 22, 23, unless they're exceptional. The problem with 5-on-0 is it becomes a fixed pattern and they don't read the defense. And the biggest thing I talk about, especially with like, if we're running a set play, is the set play is off the moment we have dominoes, which is the moment an advantage appears, because then we want the domino effect. I use all these analogies and things. And I don't want the players to keep running the set. And I think that's the problem with 5-on-0. You reinforce that you're running the pattern. Whereas instead, what I want is, as soon as we have an advantage, that could be off the first action in a set play. The set plays off, and we're just playing dominoes.
Great. I love it. It looks like in your system, you foster a lot of personality of your athletes by using a bottom-up approach, basically. And I want to know, do players have a role in their development process? As far as, do they tell you what they want to get better at? Or do they tell you where do they feel that they're good at and stuff like that, for example? Yeah,
that's a great question. I use debriefs a lot, Roberto. So this would be something like at the start, like yesterday, my small group session. And also, I do small group sessions instead of individual practices because it allows me to do the decision making. And obviously, if there's a real major problem, especially in regards to shooting, and there's an error I need to detect, then I'd use an individual practice. And drills can have a place when you're trying to change a technique. But most of the time, it's small groups. And what I do is I started the session yesterday and I said, all right, talk to the person next to you for 30 seconds about what you think we need to do today. I think it's really critical, especially for pros, to give players a chance to have an input in their development process. And I think the problem is a lot of the times player development coaches come in and say, all right, this is what we're doing today, boom, 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 boom. And the athlete never gets a chance to be involved in that process. And to me, like you said, it's a two-way approach. So I do a lot of debriefs, like in practices, during practices, where I literally just ask the guys what it is they need, and then I've got to be flexible as enough as a coach to have something ready for whatever it is they say. But it makes you a better coach doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I like it. And it's also the same approach that I use with my athletes. Even though I'm a strength coach, most of the time strength coach think that they know best. But at the beginning of the season, one of the first questions that I make to my athletes is always, what do you need this year? What do you want to get better at this year? Which are the areas that we need to work a little bit more on? Because at the end of the day, they know better than us how their body works, for sure.
Exactly. Yeah, totally agree.
All right. So, Alex, coaching youth, of course, make you wear so many different hats, right? So I want to know what's the difference between being a generalist and a specialist when it comes to coaching youth?
Oh, that's a good question. I think you almost have to be more of a generalist at the youth level. Like, I think it's so important to have an awareness of different things, such as, basic athletic performance, like how they move, mindfulness, how the kids are doing at school. And then you got the basketball stuff, the team side, the player development stuff. I think if you're lucky enough to be in a good, a good program where you can have specialists, of course, that's great. But I think, Roberto, the reality is for most youth coaches, you're going to be in an environment where it's just you as the coach, and maybe you don't have access to a strength coach, a mindfulness coach. It's just you. And I think that's where you've got to try and have, of course, the basketball knowledge has to be there, but then trying to have just a little bit of an awareness and understanding of some of these other areas too, I think is important.
How do you make sure to connect with the person underneath the jersey?
Okay, so I think looking at it like, I call this a transformational approach to coaching, and the reverse side would be transactional. So it's like transformational versus transactional. And to me, like one of the biggest, most important things I remember when I coach is that I'm not coaching basketball. I'm coaching a person who happens to play basketball. So how I coach, like knowing, I could have all the best small-sided games, drills, whatever you want to call them. But if I can't connect with the player and understand how they learn, what gets them ticking, it means nothing, right? All the stuff I mentioned on decision making means nothing if you don't have this transformational approach. So here at college, I'm really lucky because we're in a very small town. It's like a very safe environment, and a lot of our players live in the residency. So a lot of the guys I work with, every week I take a different player out for an ice cream or a pizza. And it's just, I got that from our friend Alessandro Nocera. And it's just such a small thing you can do, but for the relationship, it's amazing. It really is. And I think just making an effort to get to know the players, like even though some of them are as young as 15 and stuff, like finding out about their home life, girlfriends, what they do at school, it's really important. And I think it's, as a player development coach, you're really lucky because you kind of have a very different relationship with the guys versus a head coach. I think with a head coach, it's a lot harder because you've got to have the challenging conversations, and ultimately you're the one deciding playing time. And I think it can be a lot harder. As the player development coach, I think you're really fortunate because the relationship you have with the guys can be such a special one.
Yeah, absolutely. That relationship that you can create with young athletes is amazing. I definitely miss it. As I said before, you end up wearing so many hats, which means that you're going to be their coach first, of course, but then you're going to become their friend. You're going to become their guide. You're going to become their mentor. And that's such an amazing feeling.
Exactly.
All right, let's switch gears and let's talk about leadership. What does leadership mean to you, and how do you try to instill leadership in your athletes?
Sure. So I think leadership comes down to kind of what you stand for every day and the culture you enforce, or reinforce even in your program. And for me, having a clear mission statement and values is it's essential. If you want to be a good leader, you have to have that. So for me, like the mission statement for our college prep program next year is that we want to impact the basketball world with how we approach basketball, life, and character development. So that's our mission statement, very clear. And then we have our values, and our values are for all our staff, whether it's me as the head coach, strength coach, mindfulness coach, physio, or the social media person. I expect everyone in the program to know these values. And same for the players. So I will do things like I will, reinforce the values. So for instance, our values are going to be divergent. We think, we like to think differently and push the boundaries. Being connected, being united in everything we do, staying together, and being present. Those are our three values. So I would typically do, maybe at the end of a practice, I would say, okay, let's look at one of our values, connected. Who can give me an example of who was connected today, or the best moment of the practice when we showed this value? And I think it's once you have these values and you can decide them as a staff or with your team, you've then just got to reinforce it every day. And it's got to be there in everything you do. And for me, the simplest way of the most important part of leadership is just setting the example and showing it every single day. And it's, I can't expect my players and my other coaches to do something if I don't do it myself. So you really have to walk the talk. And I was really fortunate. One of my best experiences with the NBA was when I got to spend a week with Greg Popovich at Basketball Without Borders in Serbia. And I got to sit next to him during a lunch. And to me, it was just seeing his leadership and the whole way he approached everything it really opened up my eyes. And it's like, I want to be a coach who's really good at player development. I think that's kind of like my speciality right now. Good at X's and O's, but this leadership culture side of things, it's essential, especially if you want to work in an NBA environment.
That's awesome. I had the same experience a few times sitting with some great strength coaches like Francesco Cuzzolin, Todd Wright, and so on. And I had exactly the same feeling. This is huge. You need to be good at what you do, but then you also need to be good at connecting people and be a good leader.
And I think, Roberto, this is the biggest area in Europe that we need to improve at. I think it's very much, I don't really see much culture, if I'm honest, especially at the pro level. I don't really see many values, clear mission statements. And I think better culture would really create a world of difference in a lot of these very stressful, high performance pro team environments that we have here in Europe.
I agree 100%. So Alex, as I told you before, we started to record this episode. Most of my listeners are strength coaches, and most of them are young strength coaches trying to break into the professional world. So what does strength coaching means to you, and how important it is in your system?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I consider strength an essential part of athletic performance. And, the athletic performance program that I'll have here next year, I'll have one strength coach and one athletic trainer. To me, I think the traditional way that most strength coaches are used, I don't believe is the most effective, if I'm totally honest with you, Roberto. Like, to me, I want the strength coach involved in every single thing that we do. I almost want them to be more like an assistant coach. I don't want them to just do the warm-up and then do nothing else the rest of the practice. I want them to be in my huddles. So I'm huddling up with my staff during a practice, I want to know what they're seeing and what they're thinking. I want them to, and I think the more the strength coach understands the basketball side, the easier it is for them to then design representative activities which the players need. So to me, I really consider, like, I would have the strength coach sitting next to me on a bench in a game. If I've got two assistants, I'd have two assistants and the strength coach. And I really want to immerse them in everything that we're doing as a program. I think it's really, really important. So I think when it comes to, let's take warm-ups as an example. I think because traditionally, I think strength coaches get given that responsibility. I think when it comes down to like CLA, and the constraint set approach, I really like the warm up to be not traditional. And I think a lot of the time it's in a warm up, players never actually will go through the same movements and decisions that they're actually going to get when they start the game. So for me, that's something I'm going to design very carefully next year with my strength coach, because I want the warm up to have some level of representativeness to what they have in the game. So, I think it's the warm up's very important for blood flow, moving the joint, circulation, but then also I want them to warm their brain up at the same time. I think that's really important. And I think when I look at strength training, it's kind of like this idea of reverse engineering performance. Because what I do is I reverse engineer my offense. So I kind of start with the end in mind and I work backwards. And I kind of think it's the same in some elements for strength. And it's like that's a conversation between the strength coach and me in terms of what is it a player needs to do by a certain time frame. For instance, I might have a big man coming in, and in 1 month, I might need him to be able to do a soft hedge as a ball screen coverage and then recover. So then it's like the strength coach has a really clear idea of, what it is that we need from a basketball component. And then they can, assess whether it's realistic, come up with a training program to do that. So I think to me, it's constant conversations. And what we have is I have a player development plan for every player, which we make every month. And I make it with the strength coach and the assistant coach. And it's just an amazing way to get on the same page. And we basically come up with the 3 most important things for a player each month. And, it could be very strength related or it could be only basketball related. But I think doing stuff like that is a great way to get unity and cohesion as a staff.
Alex, great answer. I hope a lot of strength coaches and also coaches listen to your answer because it was amazing. I think a lot of times basketball coaches need to give more space to the strength coaches.
So great.
As far as decision making and also real time on the court, because most of the time, as you said, we're given just 10 minutes for the warm up and maybe 20 minutes for a weightlifting session, but there's a lot more behind that.
Oh, absolutely.
And also
I don't have time, Roberto, but it's like, my player development sessions, say I had you say me and you are running a player development session, I'd see it as like, say I start and you see that there's a problem within a particular small-sided game. Well, I would have no problem stopping my practice and maybe you do something for 5-10 minutes and then we go back to it, and this is kind of how I view 21st century training. And hopefully in 10 years, this will be a common method. But also I think it's just last thing on the constraint set approach. It's really interesting too, looking at how it can be applied in the weight room. And it's basically stuff like, so what I'm trying to have is I want our program here next year to be the first basketball program in the world where we adapt CLA for basketball and strength. And it's like, I'll give some context examples. So it's like with push-ups, instead of having every push-up the same, you basically vary every push-up because it's the idea of repetition at repetition. So maybe you put one hand slightly up, maybe you go slower, maybe you go wider. And it could be the same as a squat. As long as the technique's safe, maybe you do it slow, then the next one's faster. And it's basically this idea, you can also apply it to the weight room by getting this repetition without repetition.
Yeah, absolutely. You can apply some of those principles to the weight room for sure. And I was saying also us as strength coaches, we need to step up and make strength and make basketball coaches understand that we can provide so much more to the team and to the club than what we actually do right now. For example, I always sit next to the coaches, as you said, during games. I always sit in the coaches' room. I don't have another office. I'm here. I'm part of the staff. I'm part of every decision. I always can say something about whatever, And this is amazing.
Agreed. It's unusual. It's good.
It is. I've been very, very lucky throughout my career because I always had some bright coaches with me, Alessandro, Crespi, Oded Katash here, Vincenzo Di Meglio in Torino. So I was very, very lucky.
That's awesome.
All right, Alex, before wrapping up this episode, I want to ask you a few more things. First of all, what's the one nugget that you would like to give to all the young coaches out there?
I think growth mindset, having a growth mindset, like that's been the biggest difference maker for me personally, Roberto. Like since I was like 15, I remember watching like the FIBA clinics on their YouTube and just trying to soak up as much as I can. And like every day I put 2 hours aside just for my development. And it's like, I think it can be so difficult, especially when like seasons start and you're busy and especially, when you're in the flow of a season, you get caught up with everything and then you don't have time to keep your studying. And it's really hard. But I think for me, just having that growth mindset and constantly trying to learn, that's to me, having that approach will get you somewhere in this industry. I think it's really important, and just combining the evidence and trying to look at the basics of motor science, skill acquisition, and then combining that with your own experiences. Because I think for me, what I've tried to be, Roberto, is kind of the first practitioner, pracademic. It's like the mix between a practitioner and academic. And I think a lot of the times we have the academics who talk about this stuff, but then they're not on court every day. So it's like, to me, I'm trying to do and understand the science, but I'm an actual coach. I'm working every day. And I think that's really important to combine what you're studying and reading with your own personal experiences from your practices.
Awesome. I like it. All right, Alex, we usually finish up with 3 rapid fire questions. Okay?
Cool. Do it.
All right. First one, your favorite food in Italy? I had to ask you this one.
Ragu. I'm obsessed with ragu, man.
That's amazing. I miss it. All right. Second one, your favorite book?
Favorite book? Oh, that is a great. I recently read The Language of Coaching. Sorry, not The Language. Okay, Language of Coaching, Nick Winkelman. And that's actually more related to actual strength stuff. That was good. But then I read Doug Lemov's Coach's Guide to Teaching. And that's the best book I've ever read.
All right. Last one. Who's the one player you would like to work with?
Oh, that is a great question. I would say someone like Giannis Antetokounmpo. Get him doing all this decision-making stuff. It would be scary.
That's awesome. Alex, it was a great episode. It was a lot of fun. You gave us so many tips, and I hope a lot of coaches and young strength coaches will listen to this episode. And thanks again for being my guest today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much, man. I can't wait to meet properly, sometime this summer or next season. Thanks, man.
For sure. Bye.